I never thought that the United States political system could turn on a dime and do something like pass a package that, in the face of a crisis like this pandemic, actually allowed poverty to fall. I mean, I just can't get my head around that. Poverty fell. There's these guys at Chicago and Notre Dame that do this using the census data, do poverty rates month by month. And you have, poverty for folks with only a high school education, which are kind of like the ones that are most vulnerable in the workplace, who have the lower wage jobs. But in June of 2020 was only 17%. Okay, that was 7 percentage points below where it had been in June of 2019. I mean, that's kind of crazy. And then, of course, as the political wrangling got underway and the second package following that, the first $600 checks, and when those checks kind of like ended and we didn't have a second package on the way, poverty, of course, started inching back up again. But I would expect, given the newest package, it'll probably go down.
I'm Susan Spurlock, Executive Director of Fort Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and I am pleased to welcome you to week 5 of our virtual spring 2021 lecture series, number 46, examining the first 100 days of the Biden administration, a survey course for all. The lecture series continues with this evening's program, Fixing What's Broken, the Pandemic Economy. We are pleased to join the Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University, GBH Forum Network, our longtime collaborator and production partner in presenting this evening's program and this virtual series. This evening, we are pleased to welcome Catherine Edwards from RAND Corporation, Jim Kulko from Indeed, Eduardo Porter from the New York Times, and the evening's moderator, Lydia DePillis from ProPublico. It is now my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator, Lydia DePillis.
We have a fantastic group of folks here this evening to talk about where we are in this really devastating recession and whether we can expect to get ourselves out of it, hopefully in the foreseeable future. It's been an unusual recession in that unlike most ones before it, we wanted to keep people from going back to work because work was a place of danger while a virus was ravaging everything from meatpacking plants to subway systems. And so in the same way, the response has also been one of the weirdest we've ever seen and one of the biggest and most unusual. And in some ways, it really did succeed in keeping parts of the economy in suspended animation while we pumped trillions of dollars, literally, into both the pockets of workers and business owners. But when you do that kind of response on such a scale, I think what we found so far is that our systems for getting money out to people are a little bit creaky if they exist at all. Like the plumbing of the US economy just isn't set up well for getting aid to people who need it as swiftly as they need it. And so there have been many kinds of disparities in the types of aid that people get and how much. So we're gonna explore all of that this evening. And I first though wanted to just start out by getting a sense of really where we are, how we were in a really deep and scary place economically back last summer in some ways. And there's so many different ways you can look at an economy and how healthy it is. And so I was hoping that Catherine Edwards, as our resident economist on the panel, at least in a more macro sense, Jed is also an economist. But like, Catherine, can you give us a sense of where we're at relative to where we were and how far we have to go?
So the short version is, I would say the labor market is about half back, and that's probably as far as it can go until the pandemic is contained. So the true low point of our economy, I would say, arguably in the past 80 years was in April of last year, when the economy shed over 20 million jobs in a single month, and the unemployment rate dropped, or jumped rather, to almost 15% by kind of the official count. But all the evidence suggested that the official count was actually a drastic undercount, and it was closer to 20%. Since then, we've seen the unemployment rate drop, and we've seen the number of jobs, basically our net job loss since the start of the recession is now at around 9.5 million, but that's nothing to brag about. That's still, even a 9.5 million loss in a recession is staggering for our economy. But, we also, should not kind of, paint with a broad brush. There are people who have made it through this recession, maybe emotionally scarred by the amount of time they've spent on Zoom, but otherwise unharmed in terms of their own economic status. And there have people who have seen their lives truly upended in terms of lives lost, jobs lost, homes lost, apartments lost. And so it has been probably the exemplar of what we mean when we say that an economy and a recovery can be K-shaped, and some people do well and some people do worse.
That's right. Yeah, it's I think that whenever you hear the headline unemployment rate, people can declare victory and go home, and you see a lot of that in arguments against additional stimulus funding. But looking under the hood of that a little bit is really important. Jed, as our labor specialist on the panel, and you also have access to a lot of really rich data in terms of what types of jobs people are losing and looking for at Indeed. I want to ask this on a regional level, right? Like, because different parts of the country, as well as different types of people, have been affected. What are you seeing as far as which places seem to be doing well and which are struggling, and how that might play out in the months and years to come?
Great. So there have been actually very big regional differences during this pandemic, during the recession. And those regional differences are yet another way in which this recession has been different. Most recessions tend to affect goods sectors, either driven by oil, energy, construction, or a certain manufacturing sector. But this was really a services-driven recession because the hardest sectors, those like hospitality and tourism, some retail sectors, and so on, are concentrated in cities. And so, unlike almost every other recession in recent history, in this recession, the hardest hit places were bigger cities. Bigger cities are where a lot of the hospitality and tourism spending happens, especially business spending. So places that host a lot of conferences did especially badly. So Las Vegas, Orlando, places, tourism destinations that you have to fly to, like Hawaii, did very badly, though there were some other places, even tourism centers, that are more regional that people drive to, like in the Ozarks or the Great Smokies, that actually did fairly well. But the clearest effect has been in places where lots of people were able to work from home. The people who could work from home did relatively well in the pandemic, but people who work in businesses that serve people who have been working from home have lost the most jobs. So restaurants, retail, and local services in big tech hubs and finance centers, where businesses, where their customers basically disappeared. Those are the places and the sectors in those places that struggled most in the pandemic. And depending on how much we see a permanent shift to remote work, those are also the places and sectors in those places that might see the most permanent damage.
Yeah. Yeah, and Eduardo, I want to bring you in here because you've written a lot about rural economies, and which have over the last couple decades actually diverged from urban economies because they've lost their manufacturing jobs, and agriculture has gotten so much more efficient. So do you think this is an opportunity for those rural places so that high net worth work from home type folks might move there and create little service economies around them? Or do you think this is sort of fake and temporary and not really the solution?
I mean, forecasting the future is particularly difficult. But, I guess it depends on how this shakes up as well, when we deal with the health emergency and when demand returns. And so there are people that I talk to that tell me with total confidence that, as soon as we deal with this virus, New York's, whatever, the 10,000 restaurants that have closed will reopen, perhaps under new ownership. But we will again have a lot of the service economy that we've lost. Maybe business travel will be a little bit more permanently hurt, but we will eventually snap back to something that somewhat looks like 2019.
Mhm.
And cities will therefore, and cities will retain their allure as the places that offer all these great amenities, that bring the young people, that draw the very productive companies, the Facebooks and the Googles and whatnot. And so this kind of like ecosystem of young, highly educated workers drawn to cities that draw the companies that are extremely productive will just reassert itself. And you will not see any kind of like big geographic reallocation of prosperity and stuff. Now, that's one scenario. And as we've seen, if you look at kind of like construction permits, there's been a really big boom in new housing construction outside of cities in like exurbs and suburbs. And this is kind of like what would lead one to think that maybe cities might lose some of their pull, as some of the people that were here are saying, you know what, I'm going to go live up, in the Hudson Valley rather than in New York City, or, kind of like outside, and maybe I'll come to the city once a week rather than every day, or not come at all. And, there are certain companies that are allowing their workers to do this. That might, I find it difficult to think that would in fact kind of like reinvigorate rural America. It might kind of like, it might move more people towards suburban America, sort of like reorganize economic activity within the greater metropolitan area. But I don't really see kind of like an opportunity here for Appalachia to make a comeback. The kind of like the logic of the high tech economy and the very productive industries like finance and technology and so on that really thrive on agglomeration, on a lot of human capital stuck in the same place. I think that is really very powerful, and I can't see how these smaller places that have been kind of like left behind by our technological kind of progress. I don't see that they have an angle now in this new economy, even given COVID.
Right. You all should feel free to jump in if there's anything you want to say.
So I was going to add, I think that Eduardo's point is right. It's not going to happen magically. Like there's some, magic sprinkle dust that after this recession, rural economies will just come back because now, the knowledge class decides to live in a rural area. I think economic, success in certain communities, it takes very well thought out and deliberate economic policy that is delivered and on and maintained. And I think this kind of hope that, and now everything will just be better for people who had it worse off before. I think that that's not something that necessarily happens. You have to have policies that prioritize certain workers, certain places, certain families, certain occupations or jobs, and that can bring them forward. But it's not necessarily that there's going to be some major turnaround without thoughtful policy.
Yeah, I realize I asked you guys to all prognosticate the future before we even like really fully finished what had just happened. So apologies.
I'm happy to speculate all day.
Great. Journalists are not supposed to do as much. But so I want to go back and like kind of try to evaluate the response a little bit more, because we do have a safety net. We do have a set of programs that are supposed to kick in when recessions happen. And this was, again, a very weird recession. And I wonder what you guys think about how those systems were tested and how they performed, and if they were adequately shored up, right? So like, the major ones are unemployment insurance, and some of our direct aid programs like SNAP, so food stamps, and other forms of like making sure that families can continue to eat and care for their kids. So what do you guys think performed well, and where do you think that there were cracks that showed or deep inadequacies that need to be fixed?
I think it's hard to start anywhere other than the unemployment insurance system.
Yeah.
That it's decentralized and at this point, we probably don't need to retell all of the stories of people having difficulty getting through fraud in some states, on and on. But I think there's another, so definitely one kind of challenge that was made very, very clear. I think the other is the process of getting to agreement around relief money. It's debated, it's negotiated, which is very different than if there were a wider set of programs that basically kicked in automatically once the unemployment rate reached a certain level or enough jobs were lost. These are referred to as automatic stabilizers. They're exactly what they sound like. Things that happen automatically based on clear rules, as opposed to political debates that bring in, do we end the filibuster and can we get, a 51st vote, and things that take much longer than what you need in the urgency of a crisis like this.
That's right. And so, it's interesting how, and we can, we can revisit the unemployment system. There's so much to talk about with it. And I know that Catherine has done a lot of work on it, but one of the interesting aspects of this, the response to the recession, to me, has been the magnitude of spending and how bipartisan it was, at least up until this past week. So we spent or allocated about $6 trillion. And just for by point of comparison, the last bailout in 2009, 2010 was less than a third of that, I believe. Although the way that you count it up is a little bit subjective. So do you think that we learned, or that policymakers learned from the adequacy of that response in ways that are being applied to this recession? Or are there other reasons that account for the willingness of both Republicans and Democrats, honestly, to spend in ways that we honestly haven't seen since World War II? And yeah, whoever wants to grab that.
So, I mean, just to reiterate what you just said, it's absolutely insane that we just spent 30% of GDP in, in 3 packages or so to save the economy. We've never done that. I think the first package passed in the after the Great Recession in 2009 and subsequent years. I don't think it even hit 10% of GDP. I think the first package was about 5, and I think that part of the reason was, as you suggest, that in 2009 we did pass this package, and everybody was fearing that the sky was going to fall, inflation was going to somehow take off, interest rates were going to go up, or at least that was a very big part of the Republican arguments countering the rescue package in 2009. Didn't happen. All this money was spent. The economy actually recovered very slowly and very sluggishly, and interest rates to this date remain extremely low, and inflation remains, in fact, under the Federal Reserve target. So I think that experience of how this, this fiscal boost affects the macroeconomy did actually open a lot of space for people to say, yeah, when the argument in 2009 was it can't be over $1 trillion, in March, in 15 minutes, they agreed to $2.3 trillion. I mean, remember that in 2009, this passed, I believe, with no Republican votes, or maybe one. Arlen Specter actually left the Republican Party. I mean, I think it passed with no Republican votes. And this was, suddenly we have a deal that was twice as big, more than twice as big, that passed on a bipartisan basis. So I do think that it was the experience of that past recession. And I also think that the nature of this pandemic, there was a scary part about this. You know, gosh, our economy is stuck by this global bug that is killing us left and right. I also think that that has some kind of like psychological impact. But in any event, I'd love to hear what Catherine or Jen would have to say about, you know, how did the political economy change? Because the change is really massive.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, who knows what politicians think or what motivates them. I mean, I've joked before, they seem to have a flair for the dramatic and brinksmanship and deadlines and things expiring. That's kind of my big political economy lesson of what Congress prioritizes. It's just like something that expires that they have to vote on. But, you know, the depth of this recession was something that we saw coming. So, you know, even as early in January and February, when we had seen how China had locked down, there were economists at Federal Reserve banks and at universities who were saying that if we shut down our service sector, you know, we could have unemployment at 30%. And there was a lot of warning that this was not going to be some blip, that this was going to be a very hard recession. But I think Eduardo's right. I mean, there's a part of this this is one of the first recessions where you can truly say no one was to blame. And I think that we do end up blaming unemployed people a lot of the time for the situation that they're in. And even if we don't say that, it's kind of said without being said, you know, you're probably unemployed because you're not trying hard enough to find a job. Right. And we don't have that same kind of natural sympathy for people who are unemployed, because I think it's really hard for people to admit that they could lose their job randomly. Right. If someone is unemployed through absolute no fault of their own, that means I could become unemployed. And so I almost think that it's an easier self-defense mechanism to say unemployed people did something wrong and therefore I won't be one of them. I mean, this recession, it's a pandemic. I mean, that's not anybody's fault. That was something that was truly a shock. I think it changed a little bit of the calculus of how we talk about unemployed workers. I have to share this anecdote. I got really into reading about past disasters as we were heading into the pandemic. And I read a book on Mount St. Helens. And, you know, turns out we're not really good at managing disasters in any situation. But one of the parts of this book I put down, I was so shocked when I read it. It was the head of occupational safety for the state of Washington. And he said that, you know, before the mountain blew, it had been shaking for almost 2 months. And there had been loggers who were working on the side of the mountain under Mount St. Helens Dome who were complaining to the state to say they didn't feel safe. Like the ground was shaking and they were up in trees cutting them down and they thought they were going to get killed by a volcano. And the head of occupational safety said, in a quote, "Oh, I thought that they were after unemployment. I just thought that they were lying to get benefits. If it had blown on a Monday, they'd all be dead. It blew on a Sunday, so they weren't there." But for me, it was just this like wake up call of the depth of judgment that goes into unemployed people. So that wasn't really your question at all about the finance, but that is something that struck me as being so different this time around.
Yeah, it was, you know, the $600 a month plus up on federal unemployment benefits. Like you did hear plenty of grousing from the business community that this is going to prevent people from wanting to go back to work. But every shred of academic evidence I saw disproved that. And it was not the fact that people had relatively comfortable unemployment benefits. It was that nobody wanted to get sick or they also had to take care of kids. And again, just highlighting how different a recession this was, which is not to say that unemployment is like work or has been enough to be a work restriction in prior recessions. But one of the criticisms of the response so far as well is that it has taken what was already an unequal recession and a little bit supercharged it, right? Because the Federal Reserve also took a number of actions to make sure that the markets remained liquid, and that they've even embarked upon an unprecedented series of bond purchases to make sure that companies' debt didn't fail. And that was really helpful to a lot of people who may have lost money on Wall Street, but didn't have their like livelihoods at risk or their personal safety. So, you know, do you guys think that that could have gone differently, or that was harmful? Or do you think that it was justified to make sure that, you know, pensions didn't fail? And and that retirees were able to keep their 401ks in relatively decent shape, or that they recovered. So yeah, how do you guys assess the comparison of the monetary response to the fiscal response, acknowledging that the fiscal response has started to catch up under the Biden administration?
Yeah, I think the starting point for me is a lot of money really did go to people who needed it most. The combination of unemployment insurance and expansions of unemployment insurance and more widespread relief checks meant that a lot really did go to those who needed it most. I think there were certainly questions about how much money should have gone to businesses to tide businesses over. But this was not a case of supporting businesses who were suffering from a bad business model and should have been left to go under to let capitalism do its thing. This was much more sort of analogous to what Catherine was saying about the blamelessness. Businesses that had a perfectly strong model, lots of clear demand, where things were just frozen for a period of time. And the imperative was to preserve as much of that as possible. So when things thawed, things could restart. And I think, again, at least in terms of dollars that went out, both the money that went to people and money that went to businesses, did a pretty good job in those kinds of targeting.
Yeah, for sure. Whenever you do this kind of response, you have to balance between speed and accuracy when it comes to, getting money to people who need it most. And certainly there's people who didn't need it that much who still got some aid.
But Lydia, to your earlier point and metaphor about the kind of pipes that might need in terms of repair, I mean, the alternative to an ad hoc bailout that Congress does kind of on the fly and in a rush is a really well-designed insurance program. There's no reason why we can't have very well-functioning insurance programs for the risk that workers and businesses face. We just don't. So the example I like to give is, you have not read a story this recession about Social Security. You have not heard about old people sleeping outside of centers trying to get their checks, or, the Social Security Administration subject to a coordinated cyber attack from stolen Equifax numbers. I mean, you haven't heard any of that, and you haven't heard about spikes in elderly poverty, which is pretty incredible, given that most of the people directly affected health-wise were people who were probably on this benefit, and yet you never really heard about this problem because it's a very well-designed, well-functioning system that can take in excess demand as needed and still provide very important and reliable sources of income. You just can't say that about unemployment insurance. Because it's a program that's state-run and has been left to erode for 5 decades. And you can't say that about the Paycheck Protection Program because it was created kind of in the middle of this all. So I hope that some of the lessons that are learned here is that we don't have to throw quite so much money at the wall if we had a really well-designed means of allocating it the first time around, right? If we were prepared for risk, we wouldn't have to misallocate in the face of shocks.
Right. Eduardo, did you have something to?
Yeah, I put what Catherine just said is really hits a nail on the head. I mean, this crisis kind of showed what a threadbare social insurance system we actually have on a daily basis. I mean, if you look at it, crazy, in 2019, before COVID whacks, only about 1/4 of the people who were unemployed got unemployment insurance checks. I mean, that's kind of crazy. This is the biggest social insurance program we have for working age people. And it really misses 3/4 of them. Yeah. And the ones that it gets, sometimes they're knocked out after 12 weeks. And sometimes they get a very, very small share of their previous earnings. I mean, I think on average, the replacement rate of unemployment insurance has fallen by about 1/3 of wages. And in some states, it's much less than that. And if you earn very little money, and if you're a low wage worker, then you don't hit the hurdle, so you don't get anything. So anyway, this kind of like, I think this shock did underscore how bad our system is. But but it also kind of like, it wrong-footed me in the sense that I never thought that the United States political system could turn on a dime and do something like pass a package that, in the face of a crisis like this pandemic, actually allowed poverty to fall. I mean, I just can't get my head around that. Poverty fell. There's these guys at Chicago and Notre Dame that do this using the census data, do poverty rates month by month. And you have, poverty for folks with only a high school education, which are kind of like the ones that are most vulnerable in the workplace, who have the lower wage jobs. But in June of 2020 was only 17%. Okay, that was 7 percentage points below where it had been in June of 2019. I mean, that's kind of crazy. And then, of course, as the political wrangling got underway and the second package following that, the first $600 checks, and when those checks kind of like ended, and we didn't have a second package on the way, poverty, of course, started inching back up again. But I would expect, given the newest package, it'll probably go down. And I find that I really don't even understand it. I don't. It's not in the. I find it kind of un-American that we managed to do something so progressive and at such scale so quickly.
I mean, some people might say that's perfectly American. It just depends on what the challenge is.
But if you look at our policy since like Richard Nixon to like last March, right. It didn't really look that way.
Yeah, but I think that goes back to Catherine's point about how it had to do with who we were willing to blame for this recession, right? And how that starts accumulating or changing over time. But I did think that like one of the sort of implicit acknowledgements that our unemployment insurance system was woefully inadequate was they in the bailout bills did cover gig workers, right? Independent contractors, which are increasing as a share of the workforce, even though they're not necessarily like as big as some people say they are. But we covered those people, and the question is the regular unemployment system gonna try to cover them in the future? Because you're nodding no.
Oh no, I don't think it can. So yeah, the unemployment insurance system, I would say the two most important things to know why it is doomed to failure, a slow death, is, one, it's a state-run program. All right, so I'm employed by Uber. They're headquartered in California. I live in Indiana, but I drive to and from the airport in O'Hare. So whose system do I self-send money to should I become unemployed? Because unemployment insurance covers the work site. It is where you work. So if you live in Virginia, but you work in Washington, D.C., you pay into D.C.'s unemployment insurance system. Same thing if you live in New Jersey and you work in New York, or if you live in Louisiana and work in Texas. So if you have people where the company is owned in different states and they're driving across state, I unless there's some kind of massive harmonization that takes place, I don't know if they know who the tax benefits, who the tax contributions would be paid to. Right. But the overall point is that that unemployment insurance tax system is fundamentally flawed, because the people who pay for the benefits are employers, and not only do they not benefit from them, they're penalized if other people do. So their incentives are perfectly aligned to not want people to get unemployment insurance.
Yeah,
this has been a problem. Jed's smiling. So unless that somehow changes, unless the state financing changes, and unless the state, administration changes to take those into account, you can't add gig workers, and the program will continue to erode.
Yeah, some pretty deep structural problems there. Same with workers' compensation, although that wasn't something that we tested this time.
For the chat, I just posted a piece on this from Rand today about how states are in a race to the bottom of unemployment insurance.
Yeah. Another really important system for trying to, reallocate workers following an economic shock is worker training, right? And there's a long story about how that has weakened over the decades. You know, it used to be that more workers were unionized, and there were training programs that were operated in partnership with employers, et cetera, and that has broken down. And just the money we invested in training for middle class occupations is pretty paltry, especially in comparison to places like Europe. You have all done some thinking about worker training and skills, and I don't want to pretend like skill is the big debate in economics, like whether skills are actually the problem with wages, which I don't think they are, but there are jobs that are going to emerge from this and jobs that are going to shrink. So, you know, what's the state of our worker training system, and, you know, what is needed to try to like help it match the moment? Jed, do you want to take a crack at least like what's going to be?
Yeah, so let's, I mean, a huge question is how much of these shifts that we've seen during the pandemic outlast the pandemic. Most of the hospitality and tourism jobs that were lost will come back. And certainly the most urgent need in getting back to where we were in terms of employment is not worker retraining. It is businesses that have shut down or paused, reopening, and people who have stopped looking for work because they are concerned about their health in the workplace, or are now helping their children with distance learning, or managing because childcare is closed, getting back to work. Those all are sort of more urgent and will matter more in the short term. I think longer term, probably the biggest shift is likely to be a loss of jobs in some low wage sectors within hospitality and tourism, not because people aren't eager to travel again, but rather the increase in remote work and some of the long-term changes in what businesses spend money on will probably affect many of those hospitality and tourism jobs. Businesses will probably have send people to fewer conferences, fewer offsites now that people are more accustomed to doing some of those things virtually. And people who work remotely are not going to be going out to lunch in the near the office the way they used to. And that's why we're likeliest to see some longer term shifts, particularly in lower wage hospitality sectors. The government did some projections about what jobs might grow as a result of the pandemic. Jobs like public health experts and epidemiologists and some tech workers who could support remote work. Now, the people whose jobs might have disappeared because office workers aren't going out to lunch are probably not the people who will instead become epidemiologists. And so, it is hard to, think about worker training programs by trying to match the jobs that are shrinking with the jobs that are growing. Still, huge need for helping people develop both skills specific to an occupation, as well as broader, more general skills that are useful across a wide range of occupations.
Yeah.
I would just add to that, if I may, I would just add that to the longer term scenario that Jed's laying out here is a question here is what is going to happen with automation coming out of this emergency. Automation businesses tend to automate more coming out of recession. So, we see more capital intensive production in general out of recessions. And I expect that in this one, we might see a lot of that because there are specific reasons to automate. You might prefer a Roomba to a janitor because your Roomba is not going to get sick. And so things like also touch screens at restaurants, at least will probably see a further increase because, you know, of the risks of the health risks associated with people that you don't necessarily have when you have, you know, things like interactive touch screens and robots and so forth. So what I find really interesting is that this would be automation entering the low wage service economy where it had been, you know, not quite as prevalent as in manufacturing. So you know, accompanying these things like more working from home and so on, that'll reduce demand, or less business travel, that'll reduce demand for like taxi drivers and things like that. I also see that there might be a more of an automation push that will kind of like multiply the effect on this low end of the service economy. But I totally share with Jed the idea of this doesn't really look like a training challenge, because, you know, how do you turn a janitor into a coder isn't like, oh, let's put together this 2-month kind of program and fund it. It seems like a heavier lift.
Sure.
And you know, coming out of the last recession, a lot of the skill story, you know, it's important to remember, you know, who defines that conversation of not having adequate skills and not being able to find workers. Economists looked at job postings coming out of the recession and found that there was a, you know, I'm not referring to the show, but it's a bachelor bump, where jobs that were like for many years posted as needing a high school education, you know, in the months coming out of the recession when unemployment was elevated, all of a sudden they needed a bachelor's degree. And the skills demanded from employers for the same job were shown to creep up the higher unemployment was. And then they would say, you know, we don't have people to fill these positions, even though the positions, you know, were found to require more education, more experience, but not change the wage. And so this type of kind of skill demand without wage appreciation was a big part of the last recession. It was very much a function of the unemployment rate. So it's the skill stories, it has so many problems in being able to conceptualize as a single story coming out of a recession, both of what do the jobs need, what will the jobs be, and who's telling us what the skills need to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the other effect that the unemployment rate can have is that the tighter the labor market gets, you know, the lower the unemployment rate goes, the more likely companies are to invest more in training workers. You know, as you know, they perceive that it becomes harder for them to find the workers that meet the qualifications that they're looking for. A tight labor market gives them a pretty good incentive to invest more in training.
Yeah, my favorite example of this question of, you know, why can't we find workers is the truck driving industry, which has perennially complained about not being able to find enough people, and, you know, has shown very little wage growth until recently. And, you know, looking at this from an economist supply demand perspective, like usually if you raise wages enough, people will want to do your job or want to invest in their own education to do your job. So so hopefully that will occur to the extent that it needs to this time around. So I think that we're just about ready to have our students join us. And they have some great questions for our panelists as well. So I'm gonna turn it over to them if the Suffolk people think it's time. Awesome. Okay, I think we're all here. So I'm gonna ask folks to ask their questions in order. We have Di Matteo, excuse me, who's a master's candidate in applied politics. Go ahead and ask your question.
Well, thank you, Lydia, and thank you to all the panelists for being here today. But my question is for Jed. So you recently tweeted that core unemployment rose in February, which makes joblessness near the highest point of the pandemic. And with that being said, do you think President Biden's 1.9 trillion COVID package goes far enough to help those who remain unemployed? And looking ahead, if an infrastructure plan can get through Congress, would the impact be large enough to support job creation and spur growth in the economy?
So great question. Let me start by saying a bit more about what we mean by core unemployment. You said correctly that core unemployment is still about as high as it's been during the pandemic. That's very different than what's happened to the headline unemployment rate that we hear about every month, which went from about 3.5% to almost 15%. In a couple of months, and then has fallen most of the way back down. Most of that spike in unemployment, and again, that big spike was last year in March and April. Most of that big spike was temporary unemployment. People who either believed or were told by their employer that they should expect to be recalled. So temporary furloughs. That's incredibly unusual. Like we have never ever seen, for all the decades that these data go back, such a huge jump in temporary unemployment. It was always expected that most of those workers would either get recalled or find other jobs pretty quickly because of the suddenness of the unemployment. And so it's been useful to look at the people who have lost their jobs permanently. And that's what we mean by the core unemployment rate. That number went up, not as high as it did in the Great Recession, but it hasn't really started coming down very much. A lot of the rebound in the labor market that we've seen since last summer has been, in a sense, it's been the easy parts. Unemployment that's come down because businesses that shut down could reopen. But there's clearly this harder core group of unemployed people that it's not going to fix itself, and the risk is that people who have definitively lost their jobs end up being unemployed for long enough that they may not keep up their skills, they may lose some of the connections that help them find another job, or they may face some stigma as they're applying for jobs, as employers wonder why they were unemployed for so much longer than other candidates. The focus of the relief programs, for the most part, really has been to tide people over until the recession's behind us. But I think that this question of core unemployment, as well as people who are longer-term unemployed, that's not just a question of tiding over. For those folks, that's more a question of thinking about, perhaps jobs that have disappeared, or places where there's not as much demand for workers, or people who have been having to face other burdens, like caregiving, that has kept them out of the labor market. And so I think the sort of short answer is, even though a lot of our focus and the policy efforts have been around that huge spike in unemployment, the huge number of job loss, longer term, the focus will shift toward the people who have been permanently and longer term unemployed.
Great, thank you, Jed. Let's go next to Turner Mitchell, a freshman who is studying political science. You're on, ask your question.
Thank you, Lydia, and thank you everybody for your time. My question is for Eduardo Porter. After reading your bio and listening to episode 11 of your podcast, aptly named The Lopsided Recession, it's clear that you've done a lot of research on poorer and underprivileged citizens in the pandemic. What do you believe will help lower income, marginalized Hispanic families as they try to navigate the trail of destruction that COVID has left behind? Connected to this, are there any lessons that can be learned from other countries, such as South Korea, Brazil, or Mexico City?
Okay, let me start with the last question because that's kind of easier. I don't really think I'm Mexican. I don't think there's anything that we should be learning from the Mexican response. The Mexican policy response has been a disaster, and Jair Bolsonaro's response in Brazil has been a disaster squared. So I wouldn't go there. Korea had some very, very interesting public health strategies that I think were very helpful, at least in the first wave, at keeping the infection rate down. But I don't know a country like the United States would actually embrace something like that because they were very intrusive. It required, sharing of information of people who had been infected or who had been near somebody that was infected. And, I can see Americans bristling at that kind of use of your personal data. But I think it was, at least in the first wave, very effective at tamping down the spread of COVID. Now, on the idea of the lopsided recession, well, of course, the COVID did not create American inequality, but it hit particularly hard at the bottom end. It really exacerbated the inequalities that we already have. And of course, people of color, Latinos, African Americans, tend to be, along the lower rungs of American prosperity, and were hit particularly bad. Because they have the jobs that exposed them more to COVID, because they have the jobs that got closed when white collar people like me stopped going to the office and eating at the cafeteria. So, they got whacked on both of these margins. And so their incidence of COVID is much higher, and their economic distress is much more intense. Now, how do you help these guys? I think it's I think that we should think about how to help the more distressed is probably a good framework to think about this. And so, the first response is, of course, to try to get the pandemic behind us. And hopefully, as Jed suggested earlier, all this service economy that has employed so many Latinos in cities in the United States will come back. And so I think all sorts of these kind of redistributive policies that are that have been part of the three or responses to the pandemic are helpful. And I'm particularly optimistic about the child subsidy that's part of the Biden's program. That will be very, very helpful to Latino female workers who are in the service industry and also are home health aides and personal care aides. So for this idea of helping relieve the childcare burden is going to be very useful. But I pretty much think of it as, well, okay, what are the policies that help the bottom? And I think that so far I think the Biden proposal is actually quite good along those measures. So I'm very optimistic. I'm not sure that I could think of a Hispanic specific type of policy that would be good. Latinos are very prevalent in urban America, and they tend to be, half of restaurant workers in New York are Latinos. So if you do something about that workforce, you're really going to help Latinos.
The one extra thing I would add to that too is that obviously it's a predominantly immigrant, or at least disproportionately immigrant workforce. And one of the biggest changes from the Biden policies, from Trump's policies, is that, especially even in the bailout stuff, is they're less restrictive when it comes to recent immigrants or undocumented folks. So just as an example, you couldn't get your stimulus check if you were in a household with an unauthorized resident in the earlier editions, and then that changed later. So that's the kind of thing where if you are willing to help folks who are here without documentation, then you're going to be able to help those families.
Well, let's see what the Biden immigration, his original goal seems to be about legalizing or offering a path to legalization to a bunch of these folks, and that would be immensely helpful for these.
And Catherine, did you want to add anything? Okay. Great. So next, let us go to Crystal Brogard, who is a master's candidate in global public policy. Please ask your question.
Thank you, Lydia, and thank you everybody for being here today. My question is for Catherine Edwards. You've published research on at the RAND Corporation titled "Alternative Pathways to Retirement in a Household Context," considering the different ways couples are navigating retirement. Do you anticipate that Americans that are currently retired to go back to the workforce to make up for the financial hardships brought on by the pandemic? And related to that, Will this have a negative impact on women in the workforce who have had to leave the workforce due to the pandemic at much higher rates than men? And how do you think that this will impact the overall labor market?
Okay, I can answer this in under a half hour, I promise. So I'm going to start first with retirement and older workers, and then we'll talk about women in the labor market. So recessions have a lot of things in common, right? Unemployment goes up, the economy gets smaller, and we slowly come out of it. But recessions have very different precipitating events, right? The cause that was, it was this, and then that set off this, and then the economy declined. That tends to be really unique and really specific to each recession. So in the Great Recession, there were twin bubbles in the housing market and in the finance market, right? And we had overvalued assets. But if you think about it, for the middle class, the middle 60% of households, 65% of their wealth is in their home, and 15% of their wealth is in their retirement account. So when there were twin bubbles in the housing market and in the stock market, that meant a lot of people were worth so much less money than they thought they were even a month prior. So the story coming out of the last recession was that there were so many people who had retired or who were on the verge of retirement who could no longer afford to do so because it was a shock that truly reduced their savings and worth at a time when they were about to rely solely on their savings and worth and not necessarily the labor market. So that's not, we haven't seen that to the same degree this time, right? Because as Eduardo mentioned, it's really low wage workers who are being hit, who are less likely to have a wealth decline. Plus the housing market and the stock market have been doing incredibly well. And home prices are going up. There's a shortage of housing. That's good for homeowners. And so we don't see that same type of shock that would necessarily draw older workers back in when they thought that they were gone. And I realize that makes the labor market sound like the mafia. I didn't mean to exactly phrase it like that. But in general, we do think people will, that's not true. For some workers, they will work longer than they have in prior periods. People who are educated, people who are wealthy, and people who are in jobs that do not require much physical activity, they can work much longer than prior eras when people were when more of the workforce was in physical jobs, right? So some people are living longer, and that enables some people to work longer because their job gives them enough money and it's easy enough to do given the physical conditions. So the labor market, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics predicts that labor force participation will increase for people over 55, but you should not interpret that as everybody over 55 is working. You should interpret that as rich people over 55 can work longer if their job is not physically demanding, right? So I like to think of it as like, when you think of people entering retirement, there's the coal miner and then there's the professor, right? One of them can physically not work till 75, and one of them you might have to pry him out of his chair at 75, something universities deal with all the time, right? Okay, you're smiling. Yeah. Okay, we don't need to name names. Okay, so that's separate from separate from women, because what's happening to women is there has been an absolute explosion in caregiving need, and a lot of women were already on the verge of not being able to make caregiving work, and this made an inch turn into a mile of what they had to accommodate on their jobs, and they couldn't do it anymore. So it was two hits. The first hit was April, the month where all the jobs were lost. It hit industries where women were overrepresented, and in fact, where women of color were overrepresented. So for example, the service sector unemployment rate amongst the service occupations, it was 30%. It wasn't almost, it wasn't, if you count it a certain way, but that is where a third of Hispanic women work. So that was the first kind of hit to women, is that they were hit with job loss harder. And then the second hit was that schools didn't open in the fall, and you had kids who were home with remote learning. And so the first one was kind of a push out of the labor market, and the second one was more of like a step out. Like, I can't do both anymore. The truth is that the U.S. has never made a large scale investment in working parents and in women's labor force participation. We don't have paid family leave guaranteed for every worker in the United States. We do not have paid sick leave. We do not have access to affordable childcare. We don't have universal pre-K, and we don't have universal after-school programs. Basically, anything that the United States can do to make it free for your kid to be watched between the hours of 8:30 and 5:30 will be to the benefit of women, but we haven't done it on a large scale. So the question is, coming out of this recession, looking at this labor market, what is going to happen? I mean, we've been speculating all night, but I think one thing I can say with a degree of certainty is that the size of the economy is determined by the number of people working. It is one of the chief determinants of how large our economy is. If 2 million people or 2 million women left the labor force and they don't come back, that will clip our economic growth. And I think that we are in a position now to say that childcare investments, paid family leave investments, they are part of economic recovery if we need to draw these women back into the labor force, which in order for the economy to recover, I think the argument is there.
Yeah, I'm remembering, one of those, another thing that the bailout bills did was add a form of paid family leave in another sort of admission that we don't have it, and maybe that's a problem, although of course it was temporary and not very well advertised. Thank you for that, Crystal. And for our last question, maybe I'll go to Kate Olson, who is a freshman studying political science.
Thank you, Lydia. My question tonight is actually for you. In a recent article for ProPublica, you discuss how the pandemic is an existential threat to Black entrepreneurs. After the killing of George Floyd, there was a movement that urged others to support Black businesses. You also say that large corporations such as Coca-Cola pledged to increase its purchases from Black-owned suppliers. My question for you is, did corporations carry through on these promises, and were they effective? A related question is there anything in the recently passed COVID bill that will help these previously mentioned businesses?
Great question. It's really, so on the corporation front, there was an outpouring of pledges from big corporations saying that we'll create a supplier program. So we'll spend $10 million with Black-owned businesses, or or we will invest in this training center, or we'll do this partnership with historically Black colleges and universities. And those are all totally laudable things. But as with any sort of corporate responsibility effort, there's very little accountability into what those programs result in, if that money is ever actually spent, and more importantly, if it's really enduring. And, so I think that there are a few that are pretty explicit and will be easy to follow up on and could be quite effective. I think one of the best intention and best directed was $100 million placement of, I think it was by Netflix, that pledged to put that amount of money in deposits in Black-owned banks. And Black-owned banks have been, the number has been declining for a long time. There's now only a handful, but they are traditionally much better at lending into the Black community. And so it's not actually a loss of money. It's not a donation. It's not charity on the behalf of the company, but it is something that could really start to circulate money in those communities. So so I think that I wish that there were more of an official registry or some sort to keep track of these and follow up on them when we've moved on to the next outrage. Because I think that, there are these moments where corporations look around and see oh gosh, my competitors are making these pledges, and people are especially consumer facing companies do this more often, right? It's if you depend on your brand value. That's why you saw it from folks like Netflix or IBM or Microsoft or whatever. And you might not have seen it in companies that you've never heard of, right? Like Symantec or, a semiconductor manufacturer. And that's too bad, because that's a huge part of the economy. And if there's no visibility into what they are doing in order to support businesses owned by disadvantaged individuals, then, you're just not going to get that much sustained help. On the question of what the latest rescue plan, the $1.9 trillion bill that passed last week, is doing, and there's a few things that are important. As Eduardo mentioned, helping people of color is often just a matter of helping folks at the bottom. And it's a slightly, I think that's true. And I think, but it's a slightly different question when it comes to businesses. There is a $10 billion commitment to this, a small business loan fund that will help get some dedicated money into those businesses at a low rate and an easier application process. There's also a surprisingly interesting substantial fund, I think it's like $1 billion for Black farmers who have been long disadvantaged, even though there's like plenty of folks in the agriculture industry. And, I think that hopefully going forward, there'll be more explicit preferences for business owners of color and other disadvantaged groups. And because like that's a way of building not just jobs for folks in minority communities, but also wealth in those communities. So people who can grow their businesses and create, the kinds of bank accounts that they can get an asset collections of things that are valuable to pass on to their children. So, I think that there are steps have been taken, but I don't think they're going to do it, and more is needed. So you guys were all awesome. Those were great questions. We have a few minutes left now for some audience questions and just to dig back into what we were talking about earlier. One thing I wanted to get to, and that has come up in the audience Q&A, is about the question of debt, right? Because we are, as we've noted, spending unprecedented amounts of money, and there's a frolicking debate as to whether that's going to be problematic down the road, right? And a question of whether this kind of investment needs to be like paid for through taxes, or if we can just continue borrowing and building up our debt levels. As long as interest rates remain low, like maybe it's fine. We can just keep paying it off and revolving the debt. So, and it's not just about what we spent so far, right? Like it's also about what the Biden administration wants to spend in the coming years on an infrastructure plan that has been long promised and supposedly is bipartisan, but has yet not been delivered. So, what is your guys' take on this? Like, are we going to see runaway inflation because we've more than filled the hole that we're in from a GDP perspective? Is that concerning? Or should we really not worry about it and count on the stimulative effects of that money to help us grow our way out of it, and tax collections will recover to the extent that they need to? Sorry, gigantic question, but does anyone have strong opinions to start out?
I'd just throw out the idea that, I don't know, is that the really easy, 3-word answer? Yeah, but the idea that I throw out is that we've been over predicting inflation for well over a decade now. Mm-hmm. We've been predicting macroeconomic instability due to, government profligacy, and it's just not happened. And in fact, inflation has been too low by many arguments, and interest rates have been negative in real terms. So money has been essentially free. So just as to, I would weight any concern over debt spending right now much less than I would have 15 years ago, given the past 15 years. Mm-hmm. Quibbles with that? Well, interest rates over the last month have in fact moved up sharply, at least sharply compared to the previous couple of years. They're not like high by any means, but the slope is positive, and it's been sharper than it has been for a while. And so I guess that's something to pay attention to. I don't see a response from inflation, and I would agree with the Fed current stance that there is really no sign that would lead them to tighten monetary policy. But then, as the the Biden administration moves forward, as the ambition gets bigger, including infrastructure and perhaps other priorities, I think that ultimately we are going to have the conversation about funding this through taxation. And it's kind of like already somewhat bubbling up there, about who do we tax, what do we tax? And I think that will, I think that within, this year, that is going to become a more important part of the political conversation. And I think that ultimately rightly so, because, I think that part of the problem within the United States, this, from Nixon to last March that I was mentioning before, was that the United States has really been very reluctant to fund a functioning social safety net. And that came to hit us in the head with COVID, and it's hit us in the head times before. And I do think that maybe there's an opportunity now to think about how to fund a more robust safety net that manages to mitigate, our enormous inequality and so forth. And so I kind of welcome that conversation.
Mm-hmm. We are about out of time. Does anyone have any last thoughts or burning things they need to add?
I'll second Eduardo's point to say that, there's a lot of taxes we don't collect but could. And so it's not as if we're out of ideas and options should we need to raise taxes. It's really just a matter of if we're willing to do that to pay for the things that we'd like. And there's the Congressional Budget Office scores it every year and says, here's how much you would get from a carbon tax, and here's how much you would get from a restructuring of tax brackets. So this is not something that requires, a ton of policy design. It really requires policy will. But I will say, this conversation about, what is inflation? Is it going to result by what we do? This is when I think, I'll let Jed answer. I think this is when my profession might get the nastiest. I think it's when economists tend to pull the card of like, you don't understand because you're not an economist, but actually this is bad.
Or you're not even a macroeconomist.
You're not even, and actually I'm not a macroeconomist, so I should not be talking about inflation. Yeah, it gets very much like you're not smart enough to understand how the economy works. And that becomes a big part of the tenor of the conversation. And I'm not proud of it. It's one of the parts of my profession I really struggle with. And so I think that it's important to ask these questions and to demand to understand them and not just have people hand wave you away and say, but this is how inflation works, because the economies evolve over time. I'll leave you with this pretty incredible study that I read about that a lot of our macroeconomists are very influenced by when they graduated school. And if they finished grad school during kind of the early 80s inflation crisis, they have like systematically overpredicted inflation their entire career, and they're very hedged around it. Versus people who graduated, recently, who have never seen inflation above anything reasonable like they've predicted, who haven't seen interest rates ever above 5%, they take a different point of view. And so it's important to remember that the people who tell us what is going to happen, they don't know everything, and they're not pure scientists. They have bias of their own. And so there's room in this conversation for values, because people will add them regardless.
What a great way to end. Don't trust experts, especially economists. Okay, I'm gonna throw it back over to Christina for any closing remarks.
Thank you, Lydia, and thank you all of our panelists. This was fabulous. You managed to cover an amazing amount of territory and unpack some concepts that are big and hard to understand and demystify them. And I think you also raised more questions than you answered, which is good, right? Because then I need to answer them in class and we can talk about them and we can understand them later on. So thank you all for being here. And I guess the answer, other than don't trust experts, especially economists, is that we're going to have to wait and see. We're going to have to wait and see what recovery looks like and how we come out on the other side. So thank you also to our guests and our students for being here.